Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Season 3 of CSA Revolution, Episode 5. And I want to welcome my panelists from FIXA and Compliance Group. Got Ken Shitamoto, Senior Director IT. He's the most liberal when it comes to CSA, but we'll hear him a little later. Then we got Mr. Louis Rayal, Senior Director of BTS Quality, Regulatory and Compliance, Abbott Laboratory here in Northern Illinois. Welcome, Louis. Thank you.
Thank you.
And he's kind of the opposite end of Ken, but you guys will see it a little later. This is going to be a very interesting topic today and a very interesting webinar. And then we've got Stephen Cook, who's definitely, I'll just keep the judgment to you. Stephen is the VP Validation and Compliance at Compliance Group. He's done over 30 plus implementation, helping our clients with the CSA transformation. And our topic today, and again, just to remind everyone, this is a webinar series that we've started back September 20, and we've been really doing the deep dive of the guidance, the draft guidance, and then the objective of it is to basically let you know or need your help to submit comments by November 14th. And we'll talk to that a little bit in a minute. I just want to cover some housekeeping item that we are recording this webinar, and we'll share the recording within 48 hours. And of course, with the slide deck. Slide deck is not a lot, but it is something. Please send your questions during the webinar in the chat box, and we will take your questions toward the end of the webinar. Okay. We also have a quick survey toward the end of the webinar. Please submit it, and that will help us get you the right information at the right time, whether today or in the future. Also, please visit the handout section where you're going to see the copy of the guidance if you haven't yet seen it, so you can take a look at it, review it, and of course, submit your comment by November 14th. And you're going to hear me saying that throughout today. And what else? And also, please, for those of you who have not seen or attended any of our previous webinar, go to our website. You're going to see all the recording for the previous webinar from, well, all the seasons, but for season 3, you're going to see from episode 1 through episode 5 so far. Okay. Another announcement here I want to make, which is next week. It's a town hall that we will be in person, the entire FIXA team. A few folks will be remote, but the majority of the FIXA team will be live at MDIC in Arlington, and we will be broadcasting a virtual webinar where we're taking a lot of questions from the industry. We're answering those questions, and the purpose, again, and the intent of all of these webinars is to really relay the information of the guidance, and also encourage you to submit comments to the guidance, because we do have a due date, November 14, coming up pretty soon. So we definitely want to take all the questions, respond to them, and have you submit. So we're going to have that link also in the handout section of this webinar. So go ahead, please, and register for it. And when you get to the registration, please put your questions in here. Those questions will help us prep for the answers, so we give you the right answers. Okay, and of course, I've said it half a dozen times. I'm going to say it again. The objective of all of this, what we're doing, is to really have you read the guidance, get acquainted to it, and then if you feel something is not right, or write, please submit comments. Okay. Webinar series. So obviously we've done quite a bit of them. Yes, the intended use was recorded. I missed that one. But anyway, today we'll be talking about the determining risk-based approach in appropriate assurance activity. And this will be in the slide deck. As always, I'd like to thank the FIXA team for all of their hard work that they've done for the past 5 years and continue to come up with recommendation ideas for the industry. All right, so what are we doing today? We're going through risk analysis, types of risk discussed in the guidance, process risk, medical device risk. For those of you in pharma, don't hang up yet, right? Please stay, you'll understand why. Software feature functions operation that poses high risk and high risk process and not high risk process. We'll talk about that. And then we're also combining determining the appropriate assurance, the type of assurance activities, leverage vendor, etc. However, we're gonna cut it. We're not gonna continue on it because we want you to attend the following one, which is a very important one. And technically it's all related, but we'll get to it and you'll see what I mean. I just want to ground everyone here about the scope of the guidance, and it is not any different from what we've been preaching for the past 5 years, what the FDA has been preaching, what ISPE GAMP has been preaching, right? It's all in the GPSV that was revised back in 2002. And we are just, the objective of this draft guidance is to make changes to section 6 in that GPSV. And the only thing that is out of scope of this draft guidance today is software as a medical device and software in a medical device. Again, I'm not gonna read through all of this. It's for you to read, but what we wanna do, my panelists and I, we're gonna walk through the guidance, pull out, highlight some of the information, discuss it, bring it to you, challenge you. I want you to challenge us as well. And I know 2 of these guys on the panel, they're gonna be fighting, which I love to see. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna start with determining the risk-based approach. The big elephant in the room here, we have a couple of elephants in the room, but one of them is we've always talked about stop doing FMEA for non-product software, right? I know Stephen and I, we've been preaching. I know Ken has, I know Louis has. Let's stop doing the FMEA, right? And this is again from the guidance. Once a manufacturer has determined that a software feature, function, or operation is intended for use as a part of the production or the quality system, FDA recommends using a risk-based analysis to determine the appropriate assurance activity, right? I'm gonna stop right there and I'm jumping down to where it says, note that conducting a risk-based analysis for computer software assurance for production or quality system software is distinct, different from performing a risk analysis for medical device as described in ISO 14971. For those of you in pharma may not know what that is, but I'm gonna open it to my panelist here, and we'll start with Stephen, how he feels about FMEA, and then please pitch it to Ken.
Yeah, look, the FMEA had its purpose. It had its place. The FMEA was widely adapted by industry. It came out of manufacturing in the absence of really anything else for computer systems. When we standardized under GAMP in the early 2000s, FMEA became the practical model. But the reality is the FMEA doesn't lend itself well to computer software validation. We find over and over that requirements, the failure modes are written in the negative. Rather than saying the system can, we say the system cannot. Or people can't come up with a failure mode. And then there's a ton of subjectivity in it. There's, you know, what's the severity to you? Maybe it's high to me, maybe it's medium to you, or low, right? The detectability, the probability, all of that is very subjective no matter how we try to quantify that within our procedures. So the FMEA just doesn't work really well for software validation. I've heard people in this industry talk about how you have to do FMEA, you have to consider human factors, etc. That's appropriate for medical devices, for product. It's not a good risk measure for computer software validation. Ken?
Yeah, so I'm going to take Colin said we're going to have different views. I'm going to take a slightly different view. If you do it well and you apply it consistently, I don't think there's anything particularly wrong. I do think it's the wrong tool, and you're going to spend a lot of effort. The issue that I see that's much larger is that people are guessing at probability. And because it's very difficult, and even the guidance talks are reasonably foreseeable. So what the common man would see and common man would expect. So they're kind of tossing the common sense out to artificially sit in a construct. And at which point they generate risk matrices and then they toss them away and they still test everything. And when you do a risk-based approach, you're already assuming or you're accepting.
Did we lose you, Ken?
We lost your audio, Ken.
There,
We
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So you're accepting the possibility of having a miss in the area of your risk because you're doing a risk-based approach. You're not doing 100%. And what end up people doing is like, hey, if they have a risk, they go, oh my God, my methodology was wrong. And then they start adding test cases. So now they do the risk assessment and they still do 100% testing. So to wrap it up, I think the methodology, if applied properly, can be useful. It depends on the organization, but oftentimes it's misused, misapplied, and it's a thing. It's not just one size fits all. So, Louis?
Thank you. Louis?
Yeah, I think I fully agree. I think, in my opinion, you're basically using a bus to transport one person, to go get a McDonald's or something. It's too much for CSV. I think I would agree with my colleagues here. Is are you using it effectively? Is it? I think what I've seen in the industry, it's very often used as just a paper exercise. Yeah, we've done a risk analysis. Here you go, check, right? But the amount it takes, the effort it takes, the number of people that have to be involved to go through the exercise, is that appropriate for computer system validation? Is it appropriate for non-product? What are you gaining? What's the value that's coming out of it? Are you getting the value? And I will agree, I guess, with my colleagues, even though I would kind of promote to move away from it. But if you are using it and it is effective and it's helping you to reduce your risk and helping you to reduce the amount of validation, and then we'll give you a gold medal, because I yet to see one. But I would say continue. Otherwise, the FDA is saying you should use something that's more appropriate, for non-product and for assessing your risk.
Yeah, and I think just to add,
I've yet to see a well-done FMEA for computer software validation.
So I think it's in the construct. Sometimes people abstract it, so they're not necessarily at the individual requirement level. They're at the business process level, but they use the same construct as a framework. So then it starts coming into how do you abstract it up? So I think that's perhaps the difference when we're looking at it. If you use it, say, at the business process level, if you apply a system level risk, ultimately think about that. What is the FMEA for that entire system if it were to go around to justify your approach? So I think it's one of these things is how you look at it and what you input into it determines the effectiveness. But anyway.
Awesome. So I know this is, we want to jump back into the guidance. I know how passionate you guys are all about it. I just wanted to pitch it, so thank you for that. I want to get back into the guidance about what type of risk is the guidance really discussing, right? So we're really focusing on process risk and medical device risk. And I specifically put product risk up there because, again, the guidance is not written just for medical device practitioners, right? It's not just CDRH. And right in the footnote on page 4, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen, but on page 4 of the guidance, literally, this is what it says. This guidance has been prepared by the Center of Devices in Radiology Health, CDRH, and the Center of Biologics Evaluation and Research, CBER, in consultation with the Center of Drug Evaluation for Research, CDER, Pharma, hello, Office of Combination Product, OCP, and the Office of Regulatory Affairs. These are the ladies and gentlemen that come to your site and inspect you. So pretty much everyone is aware, everyone is involved, and guess what? Everyone within the FDA is definitely going to take credit for this, right? Because they want this. Inspectors, we've been speaking to a lot of inspectors, and they're very sick and tired of all the documentation cards that you bring them when they're asking you about an objective evidence, right? So again, I just wanted to address this bigger elephant in the room, that this guidance is applicable to all centers, to all computerized systems. All right.
Takeaway, it doesn't matter if you're in pharma or biotech, you can use CSA. Ignore the fact that it just says medical device in the guidance.
So one thing to add, that this is going to replace the section in General Principles of Software Validation, which is the current reference for all of validation, scope and application approved by all centers, CDER, CBER, ORA, etc. Point to General Principles of Software Validation and GAMP for further guidance on validation. So both GAMP and this guidance document are about CSA. And then the question I'm going to pose is, okay, if not this, if you're not going to follow GAMP and you're not going to go here, what do you follow then? There's nothing else.
If I may add, I mean, I did spend over 20 years of my career in pharma, and there are definitely, you know, we tried multiple times to come up with a risk-based approach, but the one that's being proposed now by the CSA is definitely effective, and I can see it definitely being applied to assessing risk for, you know, systems like an adverse event, you know, reporting system, to the complaint system, to labeling systems, and so on. And you can definitely apply the same, you know, criteria as far as the, you know, the risk and the implementation methods and so on. So there's a great value. So for the pharma people, you know, I agree with Khaled. No, don't hang up. Actually, read the guidance, understand it, read GAMP, and see all the what they're offering, and how this new approach can definitely help you reduce the amount of risk and increase your compliance and quality of your systems.
Thank you for that. Actually, a good segue to when you mentioned some of the examples of those systems, right? So we've got really two things that the guidance is focusing on, right? The high process risk and not high process risk, which again, we've been really preaching. Actually, the four of us, we've been on the roadshow, we've been on many webinars and conferences and talking about direct impact to patient safety, product quality, data integrity, or indirect, right? So really, that's what the FDA is focusing on. It's really focusing on patient safety. That's number one priority, right? And when we look at these systems, for example, right, the example of these systems, temperature, pressure, humidity, anything to do with maintaining process parameters, inspection analysis, you know, those the kind of system really that potentially can have patient safety impact. But again, for those of you who might think, yeah, but they don't say anything about direct or indirect. Yes, they do. The high process risk versus not the high process risk. So I'm going to send it to you guys. Ken, just give us a little bit, because really this slide and that next slide talk specifically about high process risk versus not high process risk. Can you just help our attendees really understand what's going on in there and just elaborate to it?
Sure. I think the easiest way of looking at this is you have a process risk. So you're saying that can impact production or the quality system record. The branching comes back down to, does this have an impact on product? Right? Can it ultimately, and then if you read the guidance, it ultimately talks and results in a quality issue that causes an issue with safety. So if you go through that branch and it has that possibility, then it's high. then it's going to be the high, that's going to be it's going to have an impact. And then it says like, if it doesn't, if the event occurs and it does not cause any risk, or the event doesn't cause any impact at all, then it's just like, okay, that categorically goes into the low. And then when you go into the low, then it's saying, and this is where people get confused, it says assess it as a process risk, which means go back and just say like, hey, this is what it is. When it goes and it has impact safety, then they're saying, hey, you need to consider what is the level of that impact on the ultimately product quality to drive it. So that's the part that I think people get confused the most on when it splits, that you suddenly have to say like, hey, when it goes up, what is the impact on it, the product? And then when it goes down and it has no impact on product, okay, now you have to look at it purely at process risk. That's the area where I keep seeing the most feedback. I do see one question I do want to just throw in here real quick because it goes back to the earlier side. They're saying like, are you going to be written up, get a 43 if you do not follow guidance? No, guidance is recommendation. You're only going to 43 if you violate regulation. And this is the one thing that people, there is very little regulation. You're going to get written up when, one, you didn't validate a system when you were required to validate a system. Two, your validation approach deviates from your plan, your procedure, from everything without any rational explanation. Or three, you do such a lousy job at validation, everyone could say that you might as well not have validated it, right? Your scope is so wrong, and that's where you see it, like, oh, they didn't do audit trail, oh, they didn't do electronic signatures. Everything else, and this is why the beauty of CSA, you have the flexibility, the guidance, you can do something else. And we have been using throughout my career multiple of these approaches. I'm a big leveraging fan, and this is what Khaled and I were talking or alluding to earlier. Anyway, I'll stop with that. Sorry, guys.
Yes.
I'll add something if you don't mind. Yeah, I was going to add something to what Ken just said. I mean, it's, again, whether it's the guidance or any other procedure, it says that, you know, the FDA says always, you know, document your procedure, document the rationale, the justification, and follow it. So, you know, I'm just adding to your response on the question that was, you know, posted. You know, yeah, if you were to get inspected, or there's a, you know, any type of audit, and you show, here's how I assess risk, and here's how I determine the high, medium, low, and you have those criteria well defined, and you know, as you go through that process system by system, and you're documenting the outcome of that, and it's being justified and signed off and documented, I don't see why you would get, you know, a 483. You know, I think if you don't have anything, or you are just making those decisions without justification or proper rationale, is just, you know, saying, I think, you know, or I feel this is high or low risk, this is where you're getting yourself in trouble. But bottom line is, document the process, follow the process, and that will become your defense. End of story.
Awesome. Stephen, last word for you.
Yeah, just adding on to it, it's about being consistent, right? Like Louis said, define the process, define what is appropriate risk for your organization, and follow that consistently. And if you're going to deviate from it, explain why it's acceptable. And, you know, one thing that I find very helpful in this guidance, when you're looking at the direct impact, high process risk, are those bullets below. I like to think of this in terms of when a computerized application is basically, look at this from the perspective of not high process risk, mean there's additional upstream or downstream controls in place. So if you look at those bullets in this, right, the first one there, maintain process parameters of physical properties of product manufacturing identified as essential to the device safety or quality. If you're on the pharma side, SQIP, right, sterility, quality, uniformity, identity, purity, potency. Look at the words here, no additional human awareness or review. Again, no, without additional awareness review. Essential to the device safety or quality. So this is really the measure you're looking at when you're trying to flush out that high process risk direct impact. What is the computerized, what logic in it is making decisions that requires no additional human review? And when you use that focus, that lens, you're going to see a lot of your risks drop out of that high process risk into that indirect impact.
So are you recommending critical thinking here? Just out of the, I think you are. Okay, great. So, so again, just to really kind of stay focused on these two topics, because I think really this is what's determining the risk, right, within, within this guidance. And again, this is another example of not high process risk, but really with either of them, you still need to continue validating your system, right? You need to be compliant. You need to meet the regulation. Just per Seneca Tom, when he says, I care about the destination, right? Not the journey. The journey, it's up to you, manufacturer. We just want you to get to the destination to meet the regulatory requirement. How you get there, to be quite honest with you, regulatory agencies, I'm not just saying FDA, they don't care. They just care that you follow some sort of guidance, as long as you deliver what you're supposed to. ISPE GAM 5 second edition is saying the same thing. Draft guidance saying the same thing. The GPSV that was published back in, or revised 2002, it still says the same thing. So nothing really has changed. What needs to change is us, right? We need to retool and revise ourselves to understand that there is a lean process to do this.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Any comment on this slide, gentlemen?
Yeah, I'll add. I mean, again, the GAM and the FDA, they both promote following the least burdensome approach. And the effort applied to CSV should be basically proportional to the risk identified. So that really sums it up from what we've been talking so far, as not applying the same level of risk across. One size does not fit all. Not doing more than you should. It's basically, that's why it takes us back to assessing the risk, identifying and assessing the risk, making sure the efforts from a CSV testing, et cetera, perspectives, it's proportional to the risk that's been identified. And that's what is the requirement. And that's what you need to focus on. And you don't need to go all the way to the far right to say, well, I just want to be safe, or I just want to eliminate, any potential risks that, somebody may disagree with me. Therefore, I'm just going to go and test, everything 100% all the way and so on. No one is asking you to do that. Everyone's asking you to actually apply the least burdensome approach.
There's a great question in chat, and I'd like to bounce it to you guys.
Can we keep the questions? Let's keep the questions toward the end, please. I just want to make sure we and we can get start in about 5 minutes. I just really want to go through the topics here. And one of the key takeaway, and I think Stephen, you mentioned it, and I want you to go ahead and read it, because that's exactly what you said a little earlier about beginning with the assessing upstream and downstream. So go ahead.
Yep, that's the validation of indirect functions. In other words, not high process risk, begins with assessing upstream and downstream controls, right? Most of your computer systems, even an MES system that's releasing product, you still have human intervention at the end of the line that's evaluating everything in acceptability for release. It's not making that decision on its own. So it begins with assessing upstream and downstream controls. What other systems, what other quality checks are in place? What human intervention is there? Can leverage development activities, right? So it's not saying that we're not going to test those not high process risk or indirect impact, but I can leverage what I did in development. Doesn't mean I need to have scripted out test cases for this, or even unscripted test cases if I can demonstrate that I did this during development, and may rely heavily on vendor audits and vendor documentation. We audit our IT suppliers for a reason. We should be leveraging their work and not redoing it. If our vendors are able to provide us evidence of testing those out-of-the-box functions that are not high process risks, leverage it, don't re-execute it. It does not require the same rigor as you do for high process risk.
Absolutely, thank you.
So the one thing I would add to that, the leveraging of your activities, that actually cascades regardless of risk level, whether it's high or it's low. Because when you look at the assurance activities section, it does speak to leveraging the development activities done by others. It does speak about the iterative cycles opening up for agile. So I just wanted to make sure that people don't fall into that. I think the document, one of the things that is clearly, the document has to be read holistically. You need to really read it. You could tell it's been lawyerified. If you want a more concise look at the GAMP document, there's a little more context in there. So.
No, that's a good point, actually. Thank you for that. Yes. And as you read the entire, there's a lot of repetition of words throughout. But again, I think it's because really the FDA is trying to tell you about the high process, the low process impact, and it's trying to explain it in so many different ways that sometimes in every section you see the same kind of information, which is good. Repetition makes perfect, right? Okay. And again, from an FDA thinking here, the FDA acknowledged that process risk associated with software used as a part of the production quality system are on the spectrum ranging from high to low, right? And I think we've given those examples many times, right? In terms of you have that one system that have different functions, and not all the functions are, tested at a high risk, right? And I just want you guys, and Stephen, if you just want to kick it off a little bit, to talk about the high process risk, the not high process risk, the moderate, intermediate, and low, which really we've been referring to as the high, medium, low, right? Throughout our 5 years journey. So can you just help elaborate a little bit on this?
Yeah, I mean, while the guidance talks a lot about the high process risk and testing of those high process risks, remember validation isn't done just for our regulators. Validation is done to ensure that we're delivering quality systems and meeting our business's needs. So, using that critical thinking in terms of what you need for documentation for that regulatory body doesn't mean that you're not going to test your not high process risk, your low or medium risk functions.
Awesome. Any other comments from you, gentlemen?
Yeah, go ahead, Louis.
No, I was going to say I'm holding my comments, because I know we have a couple of slides that will directly go into some of the assurance activities. So I'll hold my comments there. But Ken, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate one of the points that Stephen was making about on the low or the supporting stuff. If you read the document, it's quite clear. There's references to section 5.A. If you look at, or v.A, depending on how you want to read it. Anyway, if you go look at 5.8, that's the section that talks about the supporting mechanisms. And there, for those tools, it's really essentially saying, hey, just have good engineering practices, right? That you essentially, if you're to go into the front, just do the IQ. And I think that correlates to very nicely with the risk. They're just saying like, hey, and then you have that whole level in between where you have the flexibility as every organization is defined. The thing that I caution is people turn off their critical thinking and they just put everything in the medium because they don't want to think about it anymore. And the term that's in this document that I really want to emphasize, reasonably foreseeable, meaning that the common man would expect this to happen as opposed to likely. They're really giving us a lot of flexibility there. Right? So don't get hung up in these mechanisms. So back to Stephen's point, death to FMEA, and Louis chiming in as well. They are saying like looking at it reasonably foreseeable. They're not making you go down to that whole nitty-gritty mechanism.
Yeah.
So.
And now that you move to this slide, I can make a comment. As it says at the bottom, it says CSA is not just about testing. So when we talk about assurance activities, when we talk about best practices, do you have is your development team using standards and best practices to develop the software? Are they testing as they go? What type of static dynamic testing are we doing? Stephen talked about the vendor and assessing the vendors and the activities that the vendor has done and documentation the vendor has in place. So it's about eliminating redundancy and taking advantage of what teams have done, and taking credit for those activities that are being performed, that is considered assurance activities, that is considered to contribute to the quality of the the software and the application. So really, you need to look at it as everyone is saying. You need to look at it holistically, not just in a very narrow microscope and say, okay, I'm just gonna focus on testing or documentation of my test results, and I need to have 1,000 screenshots. No, look at everything, and that's how you can really have a complete computer software validation package.
Awesome. And when I display a slide like this, the idea is, again, this is not for everyone, right? And to your point, Ken, we don't want to give one set and just follow it all the time or do a medium all the time. But if you want some guardrails, there are some guardrails, and the guidance offers that as well, right? Would I do this for everything? Would I script everything that is high risk process or medium process? You know what? Again, we'll leave it to the teams, the IT compliance team, the quality team to really decide on that, right? Look at it holistically. Critically think about how you're going to do it. You're not going to do that for every single system, every single time. But again, I think the guidance does provide certain guardrails for those who would really, I just want to do it like this every single time. So, gentlemen, any comments or any input on the testing activities?
I think it's a good point, Khaled, that you have to do what's right for the organization, what's right for the system, right? I have seen system owners, business owners with low or medium risk functions that want that scripted because they just want to see it consistently done, right? So they want to take the guesswork away from doing that in unscripted, and that's fine. That works for that particular system. That works for that organization. Again, it goes back to thinking of that critical thinking.
So go ahead, Louis.
No, Ken, go ahead.
All right, so let the fireworks go. I don't like this. In all honesty, if you look at, I like the GAMP where we go 3 by 3 and we go to the gradient. In the spirit of critical thinking, I think Stephen, you alluded to this. The level of scripting, does create some confusion in the sense that it's matching test documentation rigor and assuming that goes into testing rigor, how hard you test something. Because the reality is they're unrelated. So the amount of scripting you need is going to be proportional to the complexity of that step and that operation, the need for repeatability, as Stephen was talking. Now, the reality is I could say like, hey, a critical feature of my car is the brake. I press the brake. I don't need a script. I just press the brake. Now, shifting, manipulating the clutch, balancing the gas while also moving it, that requires a little more detail and explanation. Now, I'll give you another example. This is where critical thinking is involved, and this is why I don't want everyone to just go down, oh, I have to go this way or that way. If you're an organization and you've got one person who really knows the system and they're like the guru and the expert, you want that person to write all the scripts. Because you know what, with instructions, because that person can then pass it out to 15 other people at execution time and keep going. And then that one person later can go back and do more of the exploratory testing. Don't get caught up because a model tells you something that you have to do it that way. Use your brain, figure out what works for your organization. Understand scripting does not necessarily equate to testing rigor. So this is where Khaled said we would have differing opinions or different aspects. This is one, I think. And I'm a big fan of.
Yeah,
go ahead, Luke.
I want to say, I mean, it's what I want to encourage people to do as well is, you've got the CSA draft guidance. Hopefully, it will become a final soon. But then also look at GAMP 5 and GAMP 5 second edition. provides the guardrails as far as when to use unscripted. It provides examples, provides a lot more details as well that you can definitely consider. So take both of them. They actually complement each other. There's absolutely no conflict between the guidance and GAMP. It's actually, you know, I encourage everyone to read both. It's, you know, a statement in GAMP 5, it says, for example, testing by any means at any phase of the cycle and in any environment contributes to finding defects, contributes to improving the quality of the software. Okay, so what they're saying is whether it's testing that's done in a development environment by developers or testing done by end users in a quality, in a QA environment or so on, okay, this is all testing, and all of that type of testing should contribute to finding defects and improving the quality of the software. Okay, so take advantage of all of that. Specifically on unscripted, they provide some examples. They tell you, for example, you know, not anybody should be, you know, when you execute unscripted, you want to make sure that the tester has some knowledge, not some, but knowledge of the software. They know exactly what they're doing. It's not just somebody off the street that is going to come in and pick up that one line and try to execute it. So it does provide guidelines as far as how to properly execute or, you know, or leverage unscripted testing versus scripted. I just want to kind of mention that.
So gentlemen, I'm going to jump into some of the questions. I know we're at time here, but appreciate it. Let me just, one question, I think the answer is yes. Have you started implementing CSA guidance in your company, even though it is in draft state? The answer is yes, I believe, for both of you. Have you updating your procedures to include CSA, or waiting for the final guidance to include in your procedures? I'd like you to answer that, Louis and Ken.
Again, we said this before in previous conferences or webinars, you know, the CSA, it's not changing the regulation. It's not a new regulation. It's more of a clarification and guidance. Okay. Yes, we have, I mean, this has been talked about in the industry for many years, and we have implemented the principles of the CSA and what kind of it promotes, the risk-based approach, applying critical thinking, and so on. Ken?
Yeah, so we, to the earlier question, yes, we have been using it for a while. Actually, even at prior companies, we have been using, because CSA really doesn't, it's has concepts that are rooted into the past. Our implementation, and the one that I like, is leveraging of the development testing. Now, that does presuppose that you do have a testing organization. We are a TMMI 3, almost 4. I think there's only 2 process areas that we were lacking to get a TMMI level 4. And we do have in our SOP, even before we started bringing CSA to the forefront, in our SOP, that ability to leverage. We did create an SOP recently that talks about, hey, here are the controls. I caution people who are going down this path to start creating these frameworks too early, that you have the flexibility in a validation plan to actually implement CSA without tying your hands, and before you figure out or understand what you're doing. That's like almost saying like, hey, when you write that SOP in advance, you're determining impact before you've decided what you're going to change, or is this the right way I'm going to change it. So I do recommend pilots. Even before we started, we did do a paper exercise, and we looked at, hey, if we did this, what would the savings be? Would there be any additional risk that gets involved in it? So
Thank you. Let me take another question here. Software for over-labeling secondary container is not direct impact, but it may have a patient risk. What is recommended to assess the impact? I think that's a good question. Anyone?
I think this is
conservative on labeling. I'm conservative on any product labeling.
So I think what it comes back down to, the example in the guidance, if there's a secondary control and someone's going to sit there and verify and look at it, or as opposed in the Europe, they're saying like, if it's automatic and that's it, and no one's ever going to check. Did we just lose college?
Probably did. Maybe I'll add until he comes back. I fully agree, and I'm always shy to answering somebody else's, you know, or assess somebody else's risk. So I think look at the guidance, look at your company, what controls do you have? As Ken said, is it fully automated? Is there a human intervention? And then throughout that, you can document, assess your overall risk and make a decision.
I'm
Alex,
back, Craig. Can you hear me?
There was
Yeah,
there were a
yeah.
lot of questions on capturing development testing. Any thoughts on that, guys? Without a test case, how do you take credit in your organizations for what's done during development?
So
Well, if you're using Agile, if you're using automated tools, well, it doesn't have to be Agile, but if you're using automated tools and the developers are executing, as they go and testing, we can find a way to, again, it all depends on how your company is executing, what procedures you have in place, and so on. But find a way to take credit for those artifacts and make sure that it's maintained. It's not something that's a throwaway. And you can document that, yes, without burdening, let me highlight, without burdening the development team with documentation. This is very powerful if you have automated tools that you're using, and you can just, preserve those artifacts. Sorry, Ken, go ahead.
no need to apologize. So again, we have a mature testing organization. We do have scripts. We do capture screenshots quite a bit, actually, because the tools enable us. The efficiency is the lack of the absence of the need for a quality oversight over that phase. Right? The artifacts stand for themselves. We're able to show with configuration management and code that we're able to show that, hey, this is a system we tested, and these test cases are relevant, and we're able to go back and look at them. So yeah, if you're saying that the devs document nothing, then there's nothing to leverage except you're saying that, hey, they did do that activity. Now, if it's a completely low risk system that you're just saying like that, then that may be enough, because then you're just saying like, hey, we tested, and then it's like, how complicated was it? If it's just a very simple, like we've done stuff where you've done a mathematical, not at my current company, but past company, but we've done like a SQL query for a migration. All we did was like, hey, we did a mathematical proof. SQL is based on relational algebra. We just said like, hey, here it is. The developers wrote it up, and that was it. That was in the design spec. That became the validation.
There's one interesting question, and I think each one of you will have a different perspective on it, and I think you've seen it. The term critical thinking has been thrown around on every webinar, but no one has taken the time to describe or define it so that people actually know what critical thinking is. How do you train people to use it? I know, Ken, you're very passionate about this stuff.
So I would say there in GAMP's guide on enabling innovation, there's an entire chapter on critical thinking. That said, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I could give you a good book on critical thinking, and it'll explain the difference between weak sense and strong sense critical thinking. And what I say weak sense is when you look at what is only at the new data to defend your current position. Strong sense, you look at everything that's out there to come up with a new opinion. My recommendation is that you adopt the strong sense version, and I'm sure if you would go to Wikipedia, critical thinking is not a legally definable term. So that's why you're not going to see it in the guidance, but there are plenty of references, including in GAMP. And then one thing I do want to plug, I know, Lou, you mentioned they could go to GAMP 5. GAMP 5 is pretty big. I would say go to the CSA appendix if you're looking, because it's going to be a more surgical strike. I do think that if they actually read GAMP, even the first version, the earlier version, you would have seen that a lot of the CSA concepts were there, and we're just doing this. Why is this a revolution? We're bringing people to actually read, understand what is there, what is written, because when you look at what is really written from a regulatory, it's not very much.
Yep. And I guess to be specific, yeah, in GAMP 5, we go to the appendix on testing of computerized systems, which is appendix D5. It has very specifics. You can read it in an hour, and I agree, GAMP is huge. But critical thinking, I'll wrap it up with a comment on critical thinking. It's not a legally defined term, but critical thinking is everything that we said. I'm looking at a labeling system, sitting there understanding, okay, is this COTS? Is it a custom developed? Is it a SaaS solution? Have I done the assurance activities? What type of assurance activities am I doing? What credits can I take? What standards do I have in place? How am I assessing my risk? And then collectively, assessing all of these things collectively, coming up with a strategy and how you're going to approach that system, documenting that and going forward. That is the critical thinking. versus just saying, my procedure says I need 10 deliverables. Let's start develop, my procedure says I need to do testing. Let's test everything, You're not a robot. You are human. Apply your human capability that God has given you and apply critical thinking.
Critical thinking is I can tell you what it's not. It's not using your last validation and find replace.
Hey,
Awesome.
One thing to add, though, Khaled, to your earlier point on scoping of this, if someone, to this point, if they still don't understand how guidance is structured and that how the FDA uses general principles of software validation as their basis for validation, what else do you rely on? What guidance? There's nothing. Okay? If you start looking at it in all of those, so even if you look at computerized systems used in clinical investigation, that references GPSV.
Yep.
So,
Even software as a medical device refers to GPSV.
yeah. So
Yeah,
the other thing on the critical thinking, if you look at what we currently do in validation based on like IQ, OQ, PQ, that is based on process validation. What we need to do is take that step away and actually look at, hey, what are we doing? Right? Ultimately, it's testing. We need to start looking at the other domain, which is testing, to understand, to basically ensure that our systems are fit. And I heard this term most recently, and I'll apply it to validation. Validation is a shallow assessment of quality, because the emphasis is the paperwork as opposed to quality. When you start looking at CSA, it's right sizing the effort so you have more time to do more testing, because that is actually the thing that is going to have the biggest impact to safety. That is an application of critical thinking at the highest level.
I'm going to take one more question. I think we're going to close. We're definitely over time, but that's okay. It looks like people are staying around, and I think you guys are okay. The guidance also specifies that factors need to be considered: configuration, management, security, etc. Any thought about that?
So that sentence is referencing on the areas where risks can come in. Right? That's saying that those are areas where risks, and that's no different when you're looking at the system. And here with the sentence underneath, I believe it's like the reasonably foreseeable. So if you're reasonably foreseeable that, hey, that you're going to introduce an error via configuration management, you're going to interfere. I think it ends with the statement and operations. I think that when you read that sentence in the proper context, it's saying that these are areas where things, it's not saying explicitly go down. Now, if you don't, if you can't do configuration, you can't maintain the control, you're in trouble. If you misconfigure it, yeah, right? You need to have business processes, that life cycle and the implementation, that you ensure the configuration of it. You need to ensure that when you design it, that you consider security. These are all areas of risk. And it's just there, I think, they were calling it out in that sentence. I can pull up the document if we need it, but going off my memory and how that paragraph was structured. Yeah. Anyone else?
All right. Let me go for another question here, and I think, well, let me go for it. CSV is computerized system validation, not computer system validation. Are you, the speakers, shifting the focus intentionally or accidentally? In short, CSV is much more than just a QA activity for software. Terminology matters, right?
Definitely more than just a QA activity. Whether you call it computer system or computerized system, right? You're talking about the documentation versus the application itself. I don't get hung up on whether it's called computer system validation or computerized system. Frankly, I feel like computerized system is a little bit of an antiquated terminology.
Thank you. All right. Let's call it a wrap here. Just last words from each one of you, please. I'm going to say my last word, which is please. I'm presenting the submit your public comments by November 14. That's really my intention out of this webinar. So you've got a few weeks left, and also don't forget to attend the town hall and bring your questions. Specifically any regulatory related questions, please bring it next Friday we will have FDA presence at the town hall. Let's start with Louis. Louis, any last words?
I would say, read it, read GAMP, other supporting guidances and standards, etc. Look at your organization, the risk tolerance within your organization, develop something that makes sense for you. Make sure it's documented, follow it consistently. That's all you need to do.
Thank you. Ken?
Yeah, I think I would hope that people look and apply critical thinking to the person who asks the questions or persons who ask that questions. I think once you understand that aspect and you wrap your head around that, then you're going to be able to apply a common sense approach. I do want to emphasize that this is just one perspective, and you don't need to comply with it. You only have to comply with the statutes and regulations, which essentially tell you that you have to do validation. And at that point in time, you do have the ability to leverage what works for your organization and makes sense. Don't make things that aren't quality required events suddenly created unnecessary oversight. And the thing that I would want, and this came up recently, is make sure your business process owners are defining this. Make sure that your validation, your testing, and your dev organizations are defining this such that they build up a value added or define the process well so it can be implemented. Then at that point, you bring in your quality organization to say, because now you know what you're going to do. Your quality organization is like, hey, that needs to be a control point. There's a compliance basis for that. But if you do it the other way, you often get caught up in this vicious cycle where everything suddenly becomes a quality issue when it doesn't need to be, and you actually don't move forward because you spend more time debating all the theoretical. So let your validation and your dev teams define what is, and the BPOs, what is the process you want to build. Then after you have basically change control, this is what I'm going to change, then you do impact, and then have everyone kind of come in later and say, how do we fix it? That's my biggest recommendation for people when they move forward on this.
Thank you, Ken. And best to last, Stephen, any last words?
CSA is not one size fits all. We've been saying this for years. We have delivered CSA at numerous organizations. They don't look alike. They fit the organizational's risk tolerance and risk model. So CSA is not one size fits all. Secondly, challenge your preconceived assumptions, right? Be open-minded, because you may find that you're actually, once you apply principles of CSA, delivering better quality, more reliable systems with faster cycles and turnaround times.
Awesome. Stephen, thank you. Ken, Louis, it's been a pleasure having you guys. Hopefully we'll hear you next Friday in the town hall. And we're collecting a lot of questions, by the way. I know a lot of the questions that came in today would not get to answer, but we're adding them to our list, and we're gonna promise one way or another they will be answered, whether via email back to you or via the town hall next week. Thank you all very much. Have a great weekend wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.